Hi, everybody. My name is Mary Kiergos. I am the Passaic County Chapter Co-Chair, along with Maria. We have Kathy here from the Executive Board, and our guest speaker, Maggie Churchill, past president of NJTESOL-NJBE. We're super excited to have you, Maggie, and share important information about the 2020 WIDA Standards. If you do have questions, Maggie's just asking to save it to the end. I do have like a little notepad and a pen and just write down your questions, and we can ask Maggie at the end. So go ahead, Maggie, take it away. We're super excited.
Okay, hi everyone. Thanks for joining us. We really appreciate you being here. We know that the beginning of the year is always a big challenge, but it's a new year and it's a new time to learn something new. I'm just going to ask if everyone could mute themselves. Thank you so much. And I want to just take a moment, if you could find the chat box, which is just down to your Zoom bar. And if you could share with me, just to kind of get a little background, where you feel you are in your learning about the 2020 WIDA Standards Framework. And I'd like you to use a WIDA proficiency level. So you're going to decide what level you are in your understanding or your learning about the 2020 WIDA Standards Framework. Are you a level 1? Are you a level 2? Are you level 3? Right? So are you that beginning entering student? Are you a developing student? Do you feel like you're like bridging, like I've got this down? It's okay wherever you are, because as I say to all my students, we are who we are. We welcome everyone, and we are all in different paths in our learning. So just so I can get a little sense of background, share that with me in the chat if you would right now. So I just kind of want to see where we are in our kind of understanding of it. So I see a decimal. I see a 3.6 in the chat box. Yeah, what do I do with those scores, right? That's kind of fun. Okay, so we have beginner and we have intermediate, maybe even, heading towards advanced, which is great because we definitely can learn from each other in this journey. And one of the goals in starting off the year thinking about this is that we want to bring other partners into the conversation, right? Some of the things that we're going to share with you here tonight, you can use these slides. The slide presentation you're going to see was created in conjunction with Hannah Prashker. She's a former executive board liaison for NJTESOL-NJBE. And she and I have co-presented many times on the standards framework. And so these are sort of our kind of known understandings about it. They're also meant to be tools that you share with others. We're going to give you some links. You can actually use these to help you bring the conversation and the learning back to your own district. So we encourage you to do the same and try to bring each other along in that learning journey. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to just share my screen, and you will see here first. Let me make sure I have the right one. Okay. You will see here a QR code. So if you use your phone to grab that QR code, you will have that access to these slides. And then I will also, when we get to it, I'll ask Mary or Maria to drop in the link to the unit sketch. Not yet, but that's also another tool that we have for you. And again, so these slides are created. We're going to be presenting the same presentation at different chapters this year. And that's our goal, is to bring the discussion back to district and help you facilitate that conversation. Okay. So that being said, I'm going to begin with just really some background introduction to the framework. So if you're that newbie, or it also helps just to kind of review the 4 major ideas in the 2020 edition of the WIDA Standards Framework. And of course, that's equity. The goal is to provide access to English language learners to help them access content and grade level material. And so there is a lot of integration. So we have the standards that we've always known, the 5 WIDA standards, but we have a lot of integration of content and language together. As you start to look through this, and you really see how the language of science, for example, is very articulated. And how it's articulated through the key language uses. The language of math is very articulated. So it's a lot of learning. We do recognize that. We're going from having, basically just a list of standards to now almost 400 pages. So there's suddenly a lot of content in our standards. And it really is going to take this year to kind of build that understanding and start to put it into practice ourselves. So hopefully what you're going to see and learn here today will give you some pointers on how to start. There's collaboration involved with our content teachers, our ESL teachers, our bilingual teachers. And our stakeholders, our parents, our administrators, our supervisors. So there's a piece and a role and a place for everyone. And collaboration is now elevated, if you would, to be included at this delivery level, this level of delivery. So the goal is that the ESL teacher, the bilingual teacher, they're not teaching in isolation. We're meant to be collaborating with our partners. And that can look different in districts. This is my first year. I'm actually co-teaching with a science teacher. And our goal is to bring together language of science for middle school and her language, her standards for NGSS that are kind of being tweaked. There's a lot of new components for her this year. So we have this chance to actually work together and play this out and sort of see how this goes. There is no playbook for it. We are kind of, forging that path ourselves. And so far it's, it's been a great experience so far, but it's a lot for both of us to learn. And then of course there's the functional approach to language development. And this is a way or a view of how to include language within units and lessons and how we can build students' capacity to have not just that awareness of language, but that actual usage and approach to how language functions to meet the purpose of their task that they're working on. Okay, so we still have the same standards that we've always had, right? So we have our 5 standards, our 5 WIDA standards that we've always had, with a slight difference in focus and intent for standard 1. So standard 1 is language for social and instructional purposes, and that's now threaded throughout all basically the 4 other standards. So it has an underlying almost like focus or intent. So it doesn't stand alone, it's threaded throughout the other standards. And this is a difference that we see in the standards framework. As you start to take a look, you will see almost as like on a landing page when you get to each grade level cluster, there is an outline of what standard 1 looks like at that grade level cluster. So you will notice that as you start to look further into your framework at your grade level. So there is a nesting idea that is behind the standards framework, and that's what these boxes, sort of a box inside of a box inside of a box, represents, right? So our standard statements that we just saw, those are the 5 WIDA ELD standards, right? Those haven't changed. But what's added and sort of nuanced as you sort of go from larger to smaller or more focused are the key language uses. There's 4 of those, so we're going to take a quick look at those. This is just kind of like laying the groundwork. And then a deeper, more driven kind of focused intent on making language explicit through expectations. And in the framework, expectations read like objectives that you would have in a lesson. So one of the things we're also going to show you today is how these pieces could actually fit in a lesson plan or in unit plans. So here's a little example over here of what those language expectations look like. And they really do look and read like objectives that you would have in a lesson plan. And finally, the proficiency level descriptors. So I don't have a specific focus on that here. They're a bit lengthy, and it's a little tricky to kind of shorten that down. A little bit of insider information. This is a little bit exciting. So WIDA is actually currently working on almost streamlining the presentation of them so they can kind of get it into a smaller package so that it becomes more of a useful tool for classroom teachers. If you recall, previously we had a rubric for speaking and for writing that was for grades 1 to 12, and K was separate. And that was a little more useful for teachers. And so there is an intent to actually create something similar where the PLDs or proficiency level descriptors that are replacing those rubrics are a little bit more classroom ready or more of a teacher tool. And that's something that WIDA is actually currently working on. So I look forward to seeing something that's a little more streamlined for us to use. Okay. 3 things I'm going to ask you to get and grab now. And make sure that you have these on your own laptop and that you bookmark, because you're going to need to access these, from now on for forever. So grab these, get them bookmarked. So you have it on your laptop. You have quick access to that. The full framework, of course, is available from the regular WIDA website, but they do have something that's new, are the grade level cluster editions. So I actually grabbed these and I sent them just to my middle school content teachers, the science teachers that I'm working with. And those are located in the resource library of the WIDA website. So that's really nice because it's not so overwhelming for a middle school teacher to just receive the language of science rather than receiving the 400 pages of full framework. So full framework we may need, our administrators may want, if you teach K-12 or if you teach K-8. If not, and you are that high school ESL teacher, grab your grade level cluster edition, and that's going to be a go-to for you. So that's just the section out of the full framework. However, the full framework does have a lot of great appendices, I have to say, that really do help understand and sort of build background information for us. You will still need to access. So in order to understand all of the terms that are used, all those specific language features that we now have to teach, those are all listed in the full framework. So you definitely are going to need to become familiar with those terms because they are now listed within the framework at the grade level cluster that you have to teach. So you'll actually find those definitions here. You won't find them in the grade level cluster edition. So it's good to have both. This is one that I would give to teachers that I'm working with or collaborating with. And then finally, that standard satchel. This is new from WIDA. And I've actually already raised this question to my district. So this is actually how WIDA proposes that we can access or get the codes. So this is a big change for us. We now have standards codes, just like in the New Jersey Student Learning Standards, how you have ELA R3.1 Part A, right? You have a code. We now have codes. And because no one really has that off the top of their head, and we need a sort of lookup, that's actually what WIDA has created, and it's called the Standard Satchel. So there's a link here that is a digital interface, and you can actually kind of click through. I have to confess, I'm not very proficient in it myself, but it is a tool that you can start to use and learn. I've already asked my district, how are we actually getting our standards number? And I gave them this link and I said, can we get this uploaded into our lesson planner that our district has, so that I can drop in my standard codes into my units and my lesson plans? That's a great question to bring back to your district too. But at least here you will have access to yourself. So there's 3 tools you're going to need to download and bookmark. Okay. So again, we're just going to do some quick background on the key language uses. So once we get past those 5 standards, the real focus or intent of units and lessons are the key language uses. These are genre families, as WIDA refers to them. Just a quick acronym is NIEA, narrate, inform, explain, and argue. You see these key language uses in most of the standards, not necessarily in all of them. So for example, you won't necessarily see narrate in science because they don't all necessarily exist within some of the content standards. So you won't see narrate in language of science, but you will see inform, explain, and argue. So you may notice that some of these are missing, so to speak, in the standards framework, and that's because there really isn't a focus for that. And so it's not something that you'd necessarily look to cover. As you go through the framework, you'll see these charts that show you how prevalent each key language use is at a grade level. So just a kind of quick, I guess, down and dirty way to sort of understand what we mean when we say narrate. There's a real difference and a real distinction of narrate in the standards framework. And it really is about telling a news story, telling a personal or a real narrative, and not retelling a story. So there's a real shift. Prior to this, there was a lot more retelling, let's say in K-2 world. The focus is on telling a story, creation of a story, not telling me back. So it's not on recall, it's on creation. And that focuses on telling a fictional story. Inform, of course, informational text. So some examples here that we've actually seen in Access, or we've seen something similar to, or similar kinds of questions would be comparing schools in different countries. What is it like here? What is it like in your country? Biography is largely inform. It can be narrate as well. Most of the time when biography is taught, it's taught as information because we ask kids to read a book about this person, give a report, that's information. Animal reports, right? So anything that you'd report on. So we typically ask students to research and then report. Explain, it's often scientific in focus. So a lot of these kinds of questions answer the how or why something happens. You often see a lot of explanation questions in science and social studies classes, things that either ask how something changes, right? That could either be weather or an animal, right? So this could be water cycle, how water moves through the cycle. Or it could be almost like a process, like the presidential election. How does that happen? How does a bill become a law? So explaining the how or why of a phenomenon would be another example of an explanation. And finally, argue. We have this in science, but what's interesting in this year is now, as I'm working with science teachers, WIDA defines this as claim, evidence, and reasoning. You've probably heard of that before. But the science standards are actually moving away from that. So I brought this up to WIDA to say, this is interesting because that's not the focus in the science world anymore. But it could also be debate and how you justify a position that you have. So that just kind of gives us an understanding. We can see these in the different standards, although, like I said, they're not all there. So as you look through the standards framework, if you see that it's not there, that's because there's not an intent or a focus on it within that grade level cluster. Okay, so another way to kind of think about those key language uses, and they really are critical to developing your lessons and units around this, is to kind of take a look at these images, these pictures. So I have just quick images that sort of might help you build an idea around possible lessons or units that you could build around argument. So the genre of argument could be a persuasive argument or something that students read around saving old growth forests and the value of trees, right? And why we need to keep these things, why we need to preserve these lands. An example of narration rather than retelling would be to create a story that might tell us the story of how Cuddlepuss lost his purr. Inform, these are ones that we're really familiar with. So when we ask students to read an informational text and give us a report about what's the difference between frogs and toads, right? So we have a lot of discussion around these animals that are really similar. How can we focus on what their unique characteristics are, that what makes a frog, what makes a toad? And then explaining those scientific phenomena in science class or social studies class. How does a tsunami happen? Where students often have to go through steps. They have to state that phenomenon. They have to go through steps and sort of tell us, explain what happens at each step. So pictures can often help us give a sense around key language uses that we already have in a lot of our units. And that's a great way to actually put things into practice this year. Think about the units that you already have. It's not something that you need to create. You can use what you have. You just might need to realize or be aware of where do I have students telling the story? Where are students explaining something? Do they have to tell me how or why something happened? Where are they informing? So where you already have this in existing units is a way you can start to infuse the framework within units that you already have. Okay, so another new, something that's new for us, as I mentioned, that we now have standard codes. And so this is actually a screenshot right out of the framework. It's WIDA's explanation of where the wording and the actual coding of the standard comes from. So when you include these in units and lesson plans, there's an order or a reference code, right, for what should be listed first. So what you list first is sort of down here in this box. You're going to list first ELD, which those are our standards we teach under English Language Development Standards. And this is for language of language arts. So if it was for science or social studies, that would change, right? So ELD dash, right? Either LA for language arts. When you look through the framework, you will see these on the actual pages of your grade level cluster. The standard satchel will also provide that for you. And then we have that grade level cluster that I mentioned right here. So you have the standard, ELD standard, language for language arts, grades 2 to 3. And your key language use is narrate, right? Which means students are going to be telling an original story. Since they're telling the story, this is expressive language. So they could be telling it orally, or they could be telling it in writing. It could be a draw and write. It could be something that they speak and record, or they say to a partner. And so when you look in the framework, you will then see the language expectations, which are construct a narrative that, and then when we look at these bullets down below, this is what the expectation is at a grade level cluster 2-3. They need to orient the audience to the context. They have to develop the story in time and event sequences. When we tell stories, we tell them from start to finish. And they have to engage or adjust for the audience, right? So how do they keep the reader's attention? How do they make it entertaining? It's a story, right? And so these are the expectations at grade level 2 or 3. This should be what we're teaching when we teach students how to tell a story. This is the accountability for grades 2 to 3. Okay. So a little bit about the intent in your lessons and unit plans is to cover the domains, the 4 areas of language development that we've always known, and that's listening, speaking, reading, and writing, are divided into 2 modes. So 4 domains, listening, speaking, reading, and writing, we know those, are really also part of 2 modes. And we already know this. It's just another way of thinking about it. So listening and reading are the interpretive modes. So I like to think of this as input, right? We listen to something, we read something. This is how the information or the knowledge or whatever we're learning about is the input in our teaching, in our lesson, right? Students might look at something, they might look at a picture, they might watch a video, they might listen to you read aloud text, they might read something with a partner, they might listen to digital text being read out loud to them, right? So they're going to need to interpret, right, this input, right? So that's interpretive mode. And the second mode is expressive mode, right? And this is where students will need to represent their learning. They're going to represent their learning through speaking or writing. So I'll revisit this again a little bit later, but for me, I like to think of this as basically within a unit or within a lesson. It might not happen within a lesson, but for me, it usually happens within a unit. We're looking for students to have input that they deconstruct and output that's co-constructed together in order to produce it. So from the work that I've been doing with WIDA pretty closely, this is what really helps me guide and design or take units that I already have and help them follow this framework. If I think about inputting to deconstruct so I can understand, and co-constructing in order to represent or express my learning. So the framework also provides us with a progression within our lesson. So think of this as a guide for what lesson plans would look like, whether it's my lesson plan or the lesson plan with the science teachers that I'm working. So these are things I'm starting to do with them now, is to start to add these pieces into science lessons in the classroom for teachers that I'm working with. And it's a little bit of a slow process because I'm trying to kind of work small. What can I accomplish and not overwhelm and what seems to fit naturally within the lessons that the teacher already has. It's kind of like I'm mapping it onto it. So we start, of course, with language for science. And because students often have to explain something, so explain is where they tell how or why, they're going to explain a phenomena in science. And then from that, by grade level, you have language expectations. So these are those objectives that I talked about. This is where we expect in a science lesson, it'll say in the science standards, it'll say that students are going to interpret or construct. So interpret is that the mode where they're having that input, right? So this is, we know this previously as that receptive language, right? This is interpretive. And then co-construction, this is where they're going to express. Somehow they're going to express or explain to a partner, or they're going to say in writing, explain how something works, or explain this phenomenon in science. So how do students explain? That's what language functions are. So when we explain something, we give evidence, right? Scientists are all about following the facts. They follow the data. So we're going to need to see that in an explanation. Do I see evidence here? Do you have sources of where did you get this information from? Was there a graph? Was there a visual? What did that data show you, right? So how does that support what you're telling me about this phenomenon? And then the language features are the actual, what I like to call bits and pieces of language. This is the language bit. This is the part that I actually love. So how do you actually give an explanation in words? What words do you use? What words do you choose? And when you look at explanations, you'll notice that you'll see these language features in them. Now, these language features will change by grade level cluster, because as students go up in grade, we expect that they can do more advanced things with language. Something else you will notice in the framework is about every 21, 22 pages or so, there is this chart. It's the same chart for annotated text. And so this chart repeats. It's the same chart for kindergarten and all the way through 12th grade. So I want to kind of preface that with big parentheses, right? This is the same chart, but it doesn't mean that we use this chart for kindergartners. And you might not use this chart with 12th graders. You're going to use the chart where you should start, where it's appropriate for your English language learners. So WIDA has a legend, and there's a reason why you'll see a chart for text annotation throughout the framework. I like to use a little more of a simplified version of this. I think this is a little hard to read. So their legend, or kind of cheat sheet, is what we have over here on the side, WIDA's legend. So when you begin to use text annotation, you choose a text, right? That's going to be part of the input that students have to interpret, they have to listen to, or they have to read it. And they're going to begin to annotate the text. It's going to help them deconstruct so they can make meaning of what they're reading. And we use text annotation to do that. And this is a model that's suggested in the framework. So I like to have this legend, and it's a legend that I share with all of my teachers. And this is something that we can bring back to our grade levels. We can bring back to our schools and get our teams, our teacher teams, and our entire school on the same color coding, right? When color coding is purposeful and intentional, students will learn to see that nouns are in red and verbs are in green. And these now become what they can associate, and they see it used consistently across the grade level in language arts classrooms, in science classrooms as well. So that as they're reading and they're looking for what is this called, right? They will see the noun or the noun phrase in red. It's color coded. We can do this with them. We can practice with them. It's also another way to scaffold text so that students can actually answer questions. And there's lots of ways to do this. I'm going to show you a couple in just a moment. So I like the kind of cheat sheet version, but I also like starting simple. There's nothing that says in the framework, just clarification, that you have to use exactly this. In fact, I wouldn't. If I'm starting and I'm new doing this, I would use maybe the first three. But you will see examples throughout the framework of how they mark up text using this chart. As you begin using this, begin with the colors and then move on to, can we find evaluative language? Can we add cohesion? Where is that used? And we're going to use circles to indicate. Clauses are underlined with italics and sentences are highlighted, a complete sentence or a compound sentence if you want to focus on that kind of construction. So it's there for our use, but it's also there for our modification because we as teachers know what's best for our kindergartners and we know where our 8th graders might be ready to start. And that's not from the same place. So it's important that we have our understanding, and that's something I would work directly with my team teachers on and make an effort to bring it back to your school, to use it on grade level so that everyone is using that same focus, that same intent, because this framework will be aligned with all other standards so that it should be used. It should be used in all classrooms. It should be the same legend. It shouldn't change. This is within the standard. This is accepted by the state. This is aligned to other grade level content standards. Okay, so here's an example of text annotation. I chose just a short text that's informational, and I'm showing you how I'm using text annotation. It might be a piece of text that I start with like this, and I already have highlighted. So I'm teaching students through interpretive mode, right? They're going to listen to me read this text out loud. It's already color coded because I'm highlighting those language features by using the text annotation chart that WIDA provides. So I'm showing them that frogs, that's in red because it's a noun. Frogs live all over the world except Antarctica. Frogs usually like lakes and rivers and ponds, but some frogs live in trees and there are others that live in the desert. So by color coding, we also teach simultaneously how these words and phrases function to make meaning, because they now learn that these blue phrases are prepositional. All over the world tells me where. In the desert tells me where, or in trees tell me where. That this isn't just reading word for word, but it's reading to chunk information so that students learn the purpose of that phrase all over the world is to tell me where, so that I can ask them questions. Where do frogs live? And by looking at the blue, they have 3 different answers. And guess what? Each one is right. That's what's magical about it, is that they're always going to get the right answer because it's color coded. So it helps them provide a key to comprehension and a way of understanding how language functions together to make meaning. So our purpose in teaching text is to help students deconstruct, take it apart to build understanding. So by deconstructing text using this annotation chart to highlight those features of language that's inherent in informational text. This is what informational text looks like. Students are going to notice those features because when I ask them to read about their own animal and produce text, I want it to look something like this. They start to notice how language functions to help us understand the text. You can highlight and color code this together. You can do the first one that is given to them. It's also a great way to scaffold text for students who might need that color coding so they know which ones they can use in an answer. I'm going to show you some examples of scaffolding. This is a kindergarten example. It's color coded. Remember, reds are noun and green is a verb. So I only have nouns and verbs. It's kindergarten, but this is what's interesting. When you look at kindergarten text, you do have a lot of pronoun reference. So this is what's called cohesion. I get my backpack. Whose backpack? Oh, it's my backpack. What does my mean? So my relates to I. So pronouns are very tricky. And when we circle it and we ask students these kinds of questions, we have a discussion around this text. What does my mean? From the picture, I get my backpack. Whose backpack is this? What does my mean? Oh, it's I. It's his. They can start to tell you. We can use the picture as clue. And we circle this because we know that my possessive pronoun for I. So they start to learn the function of this and how pronouns always have an antecedent. It refers back to a person, a who, or a what. This is the fun one. I love the next one. Bruno finds my crayons. Ask them now what my means. You may have some students that say Bruno. Does Bruno find his crayons? No, he finds my crayons. So you now have clarification. They now understand what this means. So my still refers to I, even though it's in the previous sentence. And we see this in text in English a lot. Oftentimes you have to look up, right? So pronouns have antecedents, words that come before. And again, my is repeated. So mom packs my lunch, my family hugs. So it's a great way. Another great example. This is something you can easily do on a smartboard. We can do this as whole class all together. Here's an example of a student that I worked with in high school. Here is the text that was used. And here's an example of a deconstruction chart. So when we ask kids to deconstruct text, to take it apart, I create a chart and I ask these questions. It's always a 5W plus H question. Who, what, when, where, why, how. If it's a lower level, grade level, kindergarten, I might ask who and what. If it's grade level 1, I might ask who, what, and where. I read this text and I start to ask students. Geipel said he wants to talk more about his mental health. This is high school. They're talking about how TikTok helps them process and deal with mental health issues and how it actually is a tool, a social tool for students. So when I ask who or what is this text about? So I provide already for the students, this is the subject of that sentence. They now know who this is about, right? So we can do this together to help build understanding of words and how the word is functioning in that sentence in the text to make meaning. What happened to Geipel? He got hurt. They talked about that, right? So he got hurt. He had a hard time after he got hurt. That's what happened to him. How do you feel when you get hurt? So this might have been painful because he had a hard time. I said that right here. He had a hard time. So sometimes they can even draw conclusions, right? And so kids, high school students will tune into this very quickly. And they may supply additional information you can also list here. I am looking for the words in the text. He had a hard time. What does that mean when we said we have a hard time? That's a great way to talk about colloquialisms in English. If someone says they're having a hard time, what does that mean? That means it's painful. That means it hurts you. It hurts you inside. Right? So I love how this example of a deconstruction chart helps build meaning around the text. This is how we teach reading to English language learners. And that's not taught in any other classroom. A mainstream language arts classroom doesn't teach reading for meaning. They teach reading for comprehension, assuming that students can make meaning of the text independently. I don't know about you, but I don't have those kinds of readers. That's why I use this. So it's a great example of a deconstruction chart. I also love how it's scaffolded. You can provide answers for students. You can also take it a step further and color code it. You can color code the text with that annotation chart. You can even color code the answers. You can start it. They could finish it, right? So there's a lot of potential of how you could scaffold this. This was from a high school lesson. So thinking a lot of this was the interpretive mode, as I mentioned, right? So we teach text. We have some kind of text in our lessons, in our units. We have to teach students how to interpret information, how to interpret something that they listen to, how to interpret what they read. We're going to annotate and we're going to make deconstruction charts to help students make meaning of the text. Right? Teachers often ask them, they just give them comprehension questions right away. I'm like, well, wait a minute. How are they understanding what they're reading? Okay, so flags are going up for me because I need to build meaning making first. You can't ask a comprehension question if a student doesn't understand what they read. What are you doing to make sure that they understand what they read? That's why we annotate and deconstruct. Now we're going to start to swing. So that was our input. Now we're going to start to swing, pendulum swinging the other way, and we're going to start to talk about output, right? So students have learned, they've made meaning, they've listened, they've read, and now they're going to need to tell us about their learning. Are they going to say this orally? Are they going to write something? So they're going to learn how to tell us. That's what discourse structure is. How do you tell? How do you explain? How do you narrate? How do you argue? And what does that text look like? Those are the features of the text. We're going to make a plan to help them prepare a response that's either spoken or written. So now we're going to swing towards that output. So here's an example of output. So it's an explanation of tsunamis. This is a very scientific explanation. And what I do is I look at an example of one with my students and I ask them, what is the purpose of this text? It's telling us, how does this happen? That's right. And what do we know about explanations and how they happen? So the framework actually tells us this, right? We can anticipate that a tsunami, it's going to tell me in the first sentence what it is. What is a tsunami? What is an earthquake? You're going to explain this to me. I need to know first what it is. Did they do that? They did. It's a series of massive waves that are caused by us, right? So there we have that. Okay. Then they'll start to tell me it typically happens in 3 stages. What do we think is going to happen next? They're going to give us those steps. And that's what an explanation looks like. So you have that statement of the phenomena. They tell me what it is. It's going to happen in these steps. They're going to give me those steps. They're going to tell me about each one. That's what I anticipate, right? So we need to actively teach this. How do we teach students how to give an explanation? That's our focus in that output mode. We're going to teach language function by using anchor charts. So here's an example of an anchor chart that I've actually created for an explanation. So I did this for the water cycle, but what's nice about this is that you can actually use the same anchor chart, although this is for middle school. So middle school has greater expectations. If you're doing this for 3rd grade, it's going to be a shorter anchor chart. Lucky you. Okay. But you're still going to have an anchor chart where you explicitly show students step by step, here's what comes in an explanation. So we want to make that explicit. We're going to use this as a roadmap to help us give that explanation orally. They can draw it, they can plan it so that they have success when they have to say it, when they have to write it. I'm telling them step by step what is expected in an explanation. I also give them pointers. I give them a question. I might even give students a way to start their answer, especially if it's a level 1, 2 student, beginning student, or SIFE student. They could even have a script. So how do we pull all this together? The framework actually gives us, and again, this is a screenshot right from the framework, the steps. It gives us an outline, right? It shows us basically what our lesson plan should look like. Our lesson plan is going to have the standards in it, those ELD standards with the codes that we have to learn. We have to look up, use the standards satchel for. You're going to have your content standards and your WIDA standards. I'm working with the science teachers. I have their standards. I have my WIDA standards. I also have reading and language arts standards because I am my students' language arts teachers. So I already have like 3 sets of standards. You can also include the ELD standards if you're a bilingual teacher, if you're a dual language teacher, you're using both. You're going to tell me what that KLU is. What is the key language use that you're focusing on? Is it inform, explain, narrate, argue? You'll have more than one KLU in a unit. You might have inform and narrate or explain and argue. So you can have more than one. They can overlap. What are the goals? The expectations that are listed in your grade level cluster in the framework are the goals. Think of them as your objectives you're going to use in your lesson plan. And then under each one are the bullets, the function, the structure, and those language features, those bits and pieces of language that you're going to need to focus on to help students actually construct what they need to produce. So we have for you a tool. This is a unit sketch as a way for you to start to take an existing unit that you already have and start to map it out according to the framework. So if you have the WIDA ELD standards, what other standards would you list here? Spanish language development standards, science standards, language arts standards. You may have multiple ones in the list here. And what is the content that you're teaching? So right now I'm working on, it's an engineering unit in the science classes. So students are doing a little bit of a STEM unit. So it's engineering and they have to construct models. and they have to come up with a solution to a problem, a real world problem. So key language use, there's some inform, because they have to give me some background information. They may also have to give an argument as to why theirs would be the best one to choose, best one to pick. And there might even be a little explanation if they have to tell me like a step-by-step process that could be embedded in there. Chances are it might be more inform and argue. And then when I look under my language of science, there's going to be expectations in there. Those are the objectives that I use in my lesson. And then those functions, this is the structure. I have to teach them how to give an explanation, or I have to teach them, how do you give information? How do you make an argument? What does that look and sound like? And then what language do I use to actually construct it? So this color version is here for you. And I am going to ask either Mary or Maria, if you can, to share in the chat a link that we've provided to just this black and white version for you, which might be easier to work with. And so it's going to open to a Google slide. Feel free to use, feel free to share, pass it on, share the love. This is just a sketch, a quick way to help you
Maggie,
build that
I want to share
understanding.
the link. Sorry, yep. Maggie, I want to share the link, but it's asking for editing rights. So I just want to make sure that you make it public before I'll share.
Okay. I will do that. I'm going to do that at the end. So if I can just kind of get through. Here is an example of one that we completed last year. Hannah and I did this together at the NJTESOL-NJBE conference. And this is just an example of a sketch. It's just a sketch, right? This was kind of like a quick, we did like, it was done in 10 minutes, maybe 15 minutes in a breakout room. And we asked to just kind of, let's see what we can throw down, right? If you already teach the water cycle, give us standards this will relate to. We know this is expressive. They're going to have to explain how water moves through the cycle. Okay, so we even have an article here or a link to what they use. And we have the expectation. They have to describe a process, the steps in the cycle. This comes right out of the framework. We know they're going to have to use relating verbs, different states in the process. There are several. You could pick a few more. I would, because these functions help us give the structure. So you want to use the same functions that are there. Okay, but again, this is just a quick sketch. And then what do you typically use when you explain a process? You definitely have transitional words. We need to make sure that students are using them. So we're going to need to teach those transitional terms, provide a list for them, make sure they're using it. And then you see this in science class a lot, how verbs form or change can be changed from a verb into a noun by adding endings like evaporate or evaporation, right? So we see this quite often in science text. So that's just an example of one that's kind of partially started for you. And then finally, here at the end, this is that quick link again to the standard satchel that I talked about. This is something too that I'm hoping you bring back to your district to ask them, how can I get this or I guess brought into your district lesson plan, where people often have to submit. I know in my district we have a space, it goes into real time, but my standards aren't there. So I've asked them already, how is this getting in there? I put the question out. I'm waiting on the answer, but I did put it out there. And it is a way, it gives me time to kind of start to get my feet wet and dip in. I'm not proficient in this. I'm saying that out loud. It's totally okay. It's all new to us. But it is there for you to kind of start to click around, start to like find your way along by taking a look at the standard satchel. One last reminder, just out the door, a little shout out to our upcoming conference. So we're now accepting workshop proposals. Just a reminder, start talking it up in your district. We are meeting in person May 29, 30, 31. It is our annual spring conference, always at the Hyatt, always in New Brunswick. Looking forward to seeing you there. We're going to be talking about supporting multilingual learners. I'm so excited to kind of continue the conversation with you. And I am going to just stop sharing to kind of ask for questions. And if you would kind of give me a moment in the background so that I can actually make that link editable for you. So either Mary or Maria, if you want to take a look at the chat box for me and just kind of share out a question, I'll be happy to kind of shout out an answer back if I can.
Thank you, Maggie. So if you guys have questions, feel free to unmute yourselves. This is the question and answer portion of our professional development, or you can type it on the chat.
have a question, Maggie.
Go ahead.
So I love that standards satchel.
Yes.
And if that somehow gets downloaded, let's say into whatever your data system is, like we use real time as well, that's how that that strand, the standard strand, will be put into their lesson plans. Just
I
to
mean,
clarify.
I don't know. That's the thing. Like, that's what I don't know is like, how does real time grab that? But what it will
Yeah.
do is like, you actually can go in and click your grade level cluster, your language,
I
right?
saw
So
that. Yep.
it's gonna pull that out for you and say, okay, it's ELD LA or it's ELD SCI or it's right. And then here's the cluster. And then here's that coding, that bit that goes on to the end. So it will do that for you.
Okay.
And you know, that's the goal. I haven't, like I said, I'm not proficient myself. And just to let you know, Mary, I'm on a new computer, so I'm struggling a little bit with trying to get back to that link. It's not letting me.
No, it's okay. I have it open and I see it comes out really nice. The
Okay, now I have.
standards strand with the bullets below.
Mhm.
I'm just curious on how that would show in our lesson plans, but that's something that, like you said, everyone should be bringing back to their data people in their district and seeing how, or their supervisor, to see how the data people in their district can input it into their lesson plans. Now, there's also I haven't heard any further guidance from the state on how they want to see the standards represented in our lessons or units or curriculum guides. Have you heard anything?
No, and I doubt very much that you will. WIDA has kind of provided, that's the purpose of the standard satchel. So WIDA's actually done that work. And so that's what it is. Like it's definitely going to be the standard satchel. It's not going to be something else. It is going to be that. So that was my question right away in my district. How are we getting, how is that getting dropped into? What do I have to do for my district, right? So that I have a way to click on it. Exactly. So it's not going to be something different. It is going to be that. Okay. So Maria, I am sending to you now. I redid that link. I just sent it to your email. Let me just double check which one I sent it to. Check treasurer. And you should have access to unit planning organizer. That's a black and white version of that unit sketch. I really think that's the best way to kind of just start. Because I think it's easy to see how this maps across units that you already have. And that's really the goal. Any other questions? How are we doing?
Nahid, the recording is going to be on YouTube and I'll upload it maybe by the end of the weekend, so you'll be able to see that as well.
So if
Ladies
anyone,
and gentlemen,
nope,
yeah,
sorry,
you
go ahead.
can also use the raised hand. I was going to say you can use the raised hand if you have something you want to say, or just call it out.
And I just want to share, if anyone's attending WIDA virtually, I will be there in person this year, presenting in person, and also presenting virtually a session on language features. So it's looking at those bits and pieces, those little bits and pieces of language. So that is, I believe it's on Thursday of the WIDA conference. So if you're attending virtually, I'm on a Thursday session early in the morning.
So if we don't have any more questions, I want to thank you, Maggie, so much for spending the evening with us. You are so knowledgeable and we're so honored to have you. As always, we look forward to definitely continue working with you. And for the participants, thank you also for spending the evening with us as well. I'm going to put the link to the PD certificate on the chat. Just give me a minute.
Actually,
And
I just put it in there, Mary.
Oh, awesome. Thank you so much, Kathy. You're more than welcome to go ahead and log on to that link, fill it out, and you'll receive a PD certificate via email. And also, if you feel like this was useful and very resourceful, and when you want to take it back to your district, as I mentioned, it'll be in our YouTube channel by the end of the weekend. So you're more than able to bring the recording back as well.
And Jenna, proposals are open now for the conference. They are open now. Usually the deadline is, I want to say mid-November. It's usually like by November 15th. So it's open now. Submit now.
Thank you again, Maggie. Want to wish everybody a great week, rest of the week, and have a great rest of the school year. Our next meeting is, I believe, October 19th on a Thursday. If you could follow us on Instagram, that'll be great. We have a lot of great stuff coming up this fall, and we definitely like to share the knowledge with you all. Thank you again for coming, and have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.